Okay, well, want to welcome everyone to this study today. Today is Sabbath, January 29th. And I decided, again, as we're doing different things week by week to keep everything fresh, I decided that I want to return towards the end of, I think in the beginning of, I think it was October of last year, we had done one of the portions of the Torah in in the book of Genesis, and I wanted to return to that and do the same thing. Only this time, do today's Torah portion, just kind of take things in the order in which they're appearing. And today's happens to be a section of Exodus, so we're going to do that today. And there's so much material there to cover. There's just no way that we could do it justice in going every single verse and every single commentary. We're gonna go through the whole portion and read every verse. But what I'm saying is that there's no way that I can minutely comment on every single one of those verses, because we'd be here for a few hours at least. So we'll do what we can, though, and just give a good general sense of what we're seeing there, just to get, like I said, in the promotional for today's session. We'll just get a taste of the Torah today, although we'll come up with some interesting things, I think, as we go through it. So let's start by going straight to the text. And the portion, whoops, I almost ended the meeting. That's not what I want to do. So let me share this. And you should see the text come up in just a moment here. Okay, so today's portion is the portion Mishpatim. The word Mishpatim means something along the lines of regulations or rules or ordinances, and it comes from, and like every portion, the title of the portion comes from the first verses of the scripture that we're studying. So it's Exodus 21:1 to 24:18, Exodus 21:1 to 24:18, roughly three chapters, actually 4 chapters. Okay, so if you go to this, this says We'ele HaMishpatim, and this is the word here, Mishpatim. And when you look at it in the English, it's variously translated as ordinances, or in the case of the NIV, they translate it as, that was the NASB, and the NIV translates it as laws, but it's a very broad, I don't like laws, it's just too broad. It's more like rules or ordinances or regulations. Okay, so now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. So if you're looking through this chapter, and let me just grab a paper copy real quick. I don't have any coffee on my desk today. See if we can avoid a repeat of last week. Got this just a little animated. So if you're reading through this portion of scripture, and just to remind you, when I say Torah portion, I'm referring to how the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, I'm referring to how the Jewish people have divided the entire Torah into manageable sort of bite-sized portions or sections to be read every Sabbath in the course of the year as a regular practice. And then the idea is that you usually start in Genesis right around the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, or more specifically, the last great day, what they would refer to as Shmini Atzeret. So you start with Genesis, because what happens is you end the cycle. You finish the previous cycle, and then ending the previous cycle, and then you begin the new cycle in Genesis. You finish up in Deuteronomy, and then begin in Genesis at that time of the year. And then from that point forward, you're reading every portion every week, and sometimes it's 2 portions in order to accommodate the entire Torah. And then you go through the entire year, and then you end again the cycle during the following Feast of Tabernacles, and then you begin the cycle anew again. And there are schedules that you can use, and I can actually share one such schedule with you in case that's something that you wanted to engage in as a regular practice. I used to do that with my family. Matter of fact, we did that for a couple of cycles, for a couple of years, maybe more. And we went through the entire Torah several times. I'm sure it was a bit of a chore for my boys because they were little, right? So it's not easy to go through portions dealing with like laws that we're talking about today with, lex talionis, and looking through, eye for an eye, that's lex talionis, and looking through things about, animals and negligence, and, and then of course the laws in Leviticus with skin diseases and all that. It's not fun for children, right? But not fun for adults either. But necessary to go through and to become familiar with that, because we're looking at principles, right, that will help us to live, and that's something that you can choose to do either by yourself or with your family as well to get through the entire Torah. And there's so many guides today. There's so many reference materials and websites and all kinds of stuff that you can use as a means of following along in the commentary, that you can educate yourself very well if you just take those bite-sized portions every week. So let me show you this one particular, and like I said, there are, hundreds. This is just one called Torah Resource, and you see 2021-22 Torah reading schedule. And this was just a random search I did on Google. Torah portion is 2021-2022, because remember, you're ending in the previous year and going on into the following year. So, and by the way, the Jews have been doing this for ages, right? So they've become extremely familiar with it and know whereof they speak. So they have this down pat very well. So what am I looking for? My pointer. Okay, I'm in a bit of a haze today, so I need to just bear with me as I try to get my mind out of the fog. For some reason, I'm in a bit of a mental fog today. It's very tired. So if you look at my pointer here, you see the Hebrew name of the book, the date, and it's week by week. And notice this is October, right? Because that would have been when Tabernacles ended. And week after week, you have each portion, and then there's usually a break around the holy days. They don't usually have a portion during the holy days, like during Passover, etc. And then the Hebrew name of the portion, the English name of the portion, and the particular citation, right? Genesis 1:1 to 6:8, that's Bereshit. Then they have, in this particular version, they have, and this is obviously not just a Jewish group, but this is a New Testament believing group, because they have a section that they call apostolic. So what they've done, well, let me just say what this is. The Haftarah. The Haftarah is a section of the prophets that roughly corresponds to the Torah portion for the day. The reason that the Haftarahs came into existence is because there was a time at which the Jews were prohibited from reading the Torah. So rather than not read the Torah portion for that day, there was no such prohibition against reading the prophets, right? So they used that very literally. So they said, no, we're not reading the Torah, we're reading the prophets. And then they found a section of the prophets, the theme of which sort of corresponded, and in some cases better than others, but they found a portion of the prophets that roughly corresponded in theme or an idea to the particular Torah portion that should have been read that week. And that's how the Haftarahs came to be. And then some Jews made it a practice after they were able to start reading the Torah again to just continue to read the Haftarah as well. And then apparently some enterprising New Testament believer decided they're going to do the same thing with writings in the New Testament. So I could see this here. I'm just guessing here. Revelation 22:6-21. This is talking about the new creation, right? So you could see the connection to what you have here, which is Bereshit, which is talking about in the beginning. So this is in the new beginning, right? And on we can go. But there's a nice little chart. So if you're looking at this and you're looking at today, January 29th, 2022, that's over here. Let's make this a little bit larger. So January 29th, 22, and here it is, Mishpatim. Rulings is accurate. right? Rulings, ordinances, regulations, and that just comes from the first verse. And then it's Exodus 21:1 to 24:18. And then if you want it, you can check out the other things as well. Okay, so that's that. All right, so let's go straight to the text then. And we're going to go to about 4:30 today, roughly 90 minutes. And I'm going to take this I hope, at a fairly quick clip, although, I can get bogged down a little bit. I'll try not to get too bogged down because I do want to get through the whole thing. Now, these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy before the people, right? So this is Moses who's going to set these ordinances before the people. And by the way, it's important to note that chapter 21, remember, everything you're looking at it in its proper context. Chapter 21 is closely following what? Exodus 20. And what is Exodus 20? Well, Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments, right? So you start reading in Exodus 20, starting around verse 8, and it starts giving you, not a verse 8, excuse me, technically verse 2, but really from the beginning of the chapter. And he goes through the 10 Commandments. And then closely following on the heels of the 10 Commandments, you have further explanation and going more deeply into the covenant, right? And that's what you're looking at, the beginning verses of the covenant. And remember that you're looking at major principles, right? So these things are to be taken in most cases literally, but in some cases they're sort of like case law, right? So if you think about case law in the American system of jurisprudence, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just kind of giving you my sense, my understanding. Case law is these are specific types of cases, right? But or maybe better to put that, these are general cases describing giving you kind of a core foundation for many cases that look just like it or similar to it, right? Because it's impossible to come up with, every possible situation that can come up, right? To deal with every contingency. There's just too many factors in life that if you were going to try to come up with every single thing that could come up in every situation, in every circumstance, you'd have volumes and volumes and volumes. And you already have volumes and volumes and volumes of legal documents and, all kinds of records and the like. So you just can't come up with everything exactly. So you come up with case law so that when similar situations come up in the future to this one particular case, then you can use the elements of this case to extrapolate from that particular case to apply it to what's going on in the present situation, right? So there are very many interesting examples of how that's done. And I find it interesting. Some people find it very boring. I don't know that I would ever want to be a lawyer necessarily, because there's so many things in the practice of law that turn me off, especially in the present day. But I think it's an honorable profession. I think the people who have gone on to do it, they're of a special breed. It's not easy at all to go through a legal education, and it can be a very frustrating experience. Certainly very costly, but it's also it's tough, right? You're trying to, and the stakes are high, right? Usually, you have all kinds of things for which you can be an attorney, but the stakes are typically high, especially when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with situations regarding people. By that, I mean, in everything you're dealing with people, but, if you're dealing with the interpretation of a contract, for example, it may or may not involve something that's risky to the person other than money, right? But if you're dealing with the physical harm to a person, or you're dealing with, something that someone can be imprisoned or whatever, the stakes are very high. So it's important to have people who are ethical, who are moral, people who are really adept at handling the text, because the stakes are so high, and people's people will literally be placing their lives in the hands of these individuals to make those cases. And it's really no different when you're looking at biblical case law, because you're talking about situations where that could result in some cases in capital punishment, or in other cases in monetary punishment, right? So there are all sorts of ramifications and consequences. So these cases are important to examine because the stakes are high. But what I want you to understand is that sometimes people want to take these things so literally that if something doesn't look exactly like it, they miss the point. And for us, especially in our modern interpretation of these texts, it's important to understand that we're gleaning principles from this, right? We're using these things to say, okay, we don't have that particular thing today because that was done in the ancient world. So it's important to understand the context of the ancient world, but what is the application for us today? Well, there are two ways you can really approach that. One of them is you could just throw up your hands and say, oh, it has nothing to do with what we do today, and therefore just throw the whole business out, right? That, to me, that's an incredible mistake that is not borne out by what we're supposed to do in the scriptures. To me, the second approach is to glean the principles from these cases and say, okay, that's not exactly what we have today, but we have something like it. And how is that something like it affected by what's written here in the text? So if you go away from the Torah for just a minute and you go to some place like Ephesians, right? And you see that it's talking about slave and master, the relationship between slave and master. So husband and wife, parents and children, and slave and master. Well, we don't have slave and master today because we don't have that kind of society today, but we do have employer and employee. And I believe that it's valid. And some people may disagree with me, and that's fine. But I believe that if we're going to make any kind of interpretation from that in the present day, then we have to look at what does exist for us today. And today we don't have slave and master, but we do have employer and employee. Okay, for some people it's the same thing, right? But it's principles that we're gleaning from that. So what should we glean from what's enjoined upon a master would be something that would be enjoined upon an employer. Okay, and we have many situations like that in the present day. So and in fact, our system, American system of jurisprudence, of course, is derived in large part, I believe, from the Bible. So so that's kind of the background of what we're looking at here. So immediately we're thrust into a situation of this whole idea, this whole concept of slavery, right? So Exodus 21:2, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to Elohim. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Okay, so the first thing that I want to mention here is that when people talk about these types of verses, they get very emotional, and understandably so, but they also get very irrational, because what they wind up doing is they get anachronistic about their interpretation of these passages. So they want to look, and particularly here in the United States, we look at this concept of slavery and we think to ourselves, this not we think, but people who object to the Bible, for example, they'll look at this and they'll say, well, there it is. This Bible is not worth the paper it's printed on, because the Bible, favors slavery. And whenever I hear that argument, whenever I hear that, that the Bible, upholds slavery, and therefore it cannot lay a claim to morality or any such thing, or some argument similar to that, I immediately attribute it to the utter ignorance of the person who's making that comment, because the slavery that's being described in the scriptures in no way, shape, or form is identical to the type of slavery that people normally think about when they think about the term slavery. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. Let me just kind of gloss over a few of those to give you an idea. So you have this concept here of slave. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, the word is Eved, okay? And the word is Eved, and you know the word Eved in the form of Obadiah, okay? So when you think of the prophet Obadiah, or you think about, some of you know me for a long time, and you know that the school that I went to was Obadiah School of the Bible. So essentially, I went to, by that logic, slave school of the Bible, right? You know, because the term Obadiah, this is where it comes from. It comes from this word Eved. And Eved essentially means a servant. That's what it means. So it means someone who is enjoined to servitude. Okay. Sometimes it's expressed in the scripture as bondservant in a more archaic version. In the New Testament, you'll oftentimes see that. James, a bondservant of Yahshua Messiah, right? Or Paul, a bondservant of Messiah. Paul and Timothy, Paul and Silas, bondservants of Messiah. This is where it's coming from, this concept of servitude. So when you think about the slavery, for example, that existed here in the United States, that was a form of chattel slavery that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the slavery that's being described here. Really, what's being described in most of the cases of the Bible, not all, but most cases of the Bible, is what we might consider closer to something called indentured servitude, okay? And we had indentured servitude in the United States as well, typically just completely separate from the slavery that was chattel slavery. What is indentured servitude? Well, indentured servitude is essentially, and we don't really, at least not in our culture in the West, we don't really have indentured servitude nowadays. I mean, there may be some kind of versions to that, but not even close to what it used to be. Indentured servitude was a concept of you becoming a servant to a master in order to pay a debt that you were unable to pay. There are actually a few ways that you could become an indentured servant in the ancient world. So if you were a pauper, right? If you were just like so poor that you could not afford to pay for, for certain debts that you had, then if you were just poor, period. If you were poor to the point where you're homeless, then you could become an indentured servant so that you could get room and board, right? You can get fed. If you had a family, you can get your family fed, etc. And that was indentured servitude in order to do that. If you were a debtor, if you had to buy something, some kind of major purchase, or if you had to find a way to get a place to live or whatever, and you couldn't pay that back because maybe you lost whatever employment you had, or for whatever reason you were a debtor, then you would become an indentured servant until you paid off your debt. And then the other major way that you became an indentured servant is if you were a thief and you were caught, and typically a criminal is not going to be able to pay back, to the victim what they owe. Ideally, and you see instances in the scriptures of a criminal having to pay back restitution. And if you could pay restitution, good and well, and you paid restitution, and then the business was done. But what if you couldn't pay back? What if you couldn't, restore? Well, you had to. They didn't really have prisons in the sense that we have prisons nowadays, right? So you couldn't put someone in prison to work, to essentially, what they couldn't pay back in terms of money, they pay back in terms of time of service away from society, right? But they didn't have that. So what you did was you became an indentured servant until you could pay off your debt. And when before we tend to be very judgmental about looking at an ancient culture and an ancient society and ascribing all sorts of motive and all sorts of agendas to them. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're imposing upon the past our idea of ethics and morality based upon the way our system is today, which is incredibly different than what it was in the ancient world. So it's very easy for us to become judgmental out of sheer ignorance based upon the differences that we have today as compared to the past. For example, if taking it away from the idea of servitude for a minute here and looking at some of the things that women went through in the ancient world, again, people look at things anachronistically. From our perspective in the 21st century, of course, there are things that look morally questionable, right? But when you look at it through the eyes of someone in the ancient world, how a woman was treated in certain circumstances, you find that there were actually protections for women, at least from the Bible anyway. These things were actually done by means of protection as compared to, the idea of oppression or repression. So that might not jibe with our modern day sensibilities, because we live in a much different world. And it's easy for us in the present day to take all the advances that we had over literally millennia, okay, not just hundreds of years, but literally over thousands of years of history, the kind of conventions that we have in place for, for gender and everything else, and to try to impose that upon a world that knew nothing of the kind. In those days, if a woman was not married, or she was not, subject to a master, in the case like we're going to see in a few minutes here with the indentured servitude of a handmaid, she went hungry, she died. There was no question about it. There was no safety net in the ancient world as we know safety nets today. It just was unheard of. It didn't exist. So if you didn't have some of these protections in place, that person simply, whether female in the case that I'm describing, or in the case of the other indentured servants that are being described, these people actually just died because they had no way to sustain themselves. And it was a harsh, cruel world that didn't have all the, conveniences that we have today and all the different elements of safety net involved. So, for people to pass judgment on the Bible, which is what they do, it's actually just very, very ignorant, and it betrays a misunderstanding of what those things were meant to do for protection for people in the ancient world. So let's go back to these verses here and just get a little bit more clarification. So the idea of indentured servitude was you would become indebted to this master who would provide for your needs, and you would work in return until you paid off your debt, or until, in the case of a Hebrew slave, 6 years. So as you're going through this, you're going to see also protections that are biblical protections that were unheard of in the ancient world. So I will defend to the teeth the biblical way of doing things, as compared to, say, so much fanfare is given by scholars about things like the laws of Hammurabi and others, and they always want to diminish the Bible by pointing to other societies who had this, that, and the other thing. Oh, the Hebrews weren't unique, and these other one had, and the Code of Hammurabi, and Egyptian this, and Babylonian that. And when you look at the Egyptian thing, or Babylonian thing, or Code of Hammurabi, you see how woefully inadequate they were compared to what the Bible, the innovations of the scriptures for the ancient world. And I'll point out just a couple of those as we go through this. Okay, so be careful when you run into people who have simplistic, I guess is my major point here, who have simplistic explanations about what the Bible terms, what the Bible teaches about slavery or women, or whenever you hear those kind of simplistic explanations, recognize them as the simplistic things in which they are, and dig deeper before you cast aspersion upon what the scriptures give, because you're going to be making a mistake. So if you buy a Hebrew slave, you have a Hebrew indentured servant, essentially, he shall serve for 6 years. Okay, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. So if first of all, if you paid off your debt during that 6-year period, you're free. You go. What other slave in other ancient societies was allowed to do that? Not many, if any. Right. So that's an innovation. That's strictly biblical. Then in the 7th year, which is, of course, the year of release, it's actually termed the year of release. If you, by the 7th year, if you weren't able to pay everything off, you just went free, period. Right? Again, what other society allowed that to happen? Nothing. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. So whatever he came to the arrangement with, and notice that he enters into that arrangement of his own free will. This is another proof that this is apples and oranges when you're talking about, because the one that's most vivid to people, as soon as they hear the word slavery, they think, United States, 1700s, 1800s, right? Not even close to what's being described here. So first of all, another thing that you can immediately notice here is this person becomes an indentured servant out of his own free will, not free will in the sense that he'd like to do it, but because he knows that he has to get into this arrangement in order to survive. So he chooses to do it. And he does this sometimes, bringing his entire family with him. If he has a wife and if he has children, he comes with them into the relationship, because this is the only way that they can survive as a family. Okay, this is not, you see nothing there about a person being kidnapped, bodily kidnapped, in order to be put into servitude, which is what happened in the United States and in other places as well. And by the way, I want to mention that too. So much is made about the United States, and I don't want to go into a political route here, but I do want to mention, because it's worth mentioning, that the United States is viewed as one of the most evil societies that ever existed on the face of the earth because of the slavery situation, and it was terrible. There's no question about that. But so was every other society. Somehow there's this implication that other societies, whether in Europe or in Africa or in the Middle East or wherever, in Asia, that there were all these other enlightened societies, and that the United States was this one main evil thing that did something that was so out of the pale as everyone else. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every society that you can point to had slavery in some way, shape, or form, because slavery was the engine of progress moving forward, because they didn't have machinery like we have. So they had slaves. Terrible? Yes, terrible. The way that people did it, terrible. But it was a reality of the ancient world, and coming and only of recent. And when I say recent, I'm talking like within the last several hundred years. Only in the recent hundreds of years has that improved for humanity. And in some cases, it's still going on. And if you don't believe that, think about the sex trading, right? The human trafficking that's going on, which is what? It's a form of slavery. And it's happening all over the world in this enlightened world in which we live. So we got to be careful about these moral high horses that we tend to get on as a society, and how we want to cast aspersion when we don't understand all the facts that are going on. Okay, so going back to the issue of the indentured servant as compared to the slave as just focusing, because what we know mainly here in the United States, but it happened all over the world, was kidnapped and put into servitude. That's not what's being described here. Why do I know that? Because kidnapping was a capital offense in the Bible, and we'll see that. Okay, and matter of fact, let's just take a quick look at that, because it bears. Is the text back on screen? Please let me know in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so just a few verses down, Exodus 21:16. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Period. That you can't be clearer than that, right? So the concept of kidnapping a person from another country and dragging them off to another country, that would never happen here, because this is a society that would put you to death. Very few things that there is for which there's a capital that are considered a capital offense, meaning that there's the death penalty, and this was one of them. As a matter of fact, remember I said that these commandments here, you're going into greater detail of what came before it, which is, this is why I always want to look at the Bible in terms of the context, right? In Exodus 20, you have the stating of the 10 commandments, and then now you have some more nuance that's being given throughout the rest of the covenant that's listed, through, from 20 to 24, which is mainly what we're reading today, and other places in the Torah. So part of the nuance is being described here. Well, what is the general statement from which this nuance of kidnapping is taken? Well, it's taken from the 8th commandment: you shall not steal. Most Jewish commentators in particular, and most people who know what they're talking about, know that the commandment, you shall not steal, is not talking about stealing an apple from your neighbor, or stealing, a cart from your neighbor, or an animal from your neighbor. It's referring, first and foremost, it's referring to the stealing of a person, kidnapping. That is the main thrust of the commandment, you shall not steal. And of course, it extends to other things that are not your property, right? And that's reflected when you look at the law about covetousness. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, et cetera, et cetera. And by extension, you shall not steal any of those things, because you shouldn't be coveting any of those things, right? But primarily, it was an indication of kidnapping. You shall not steal. You shall not steal another human being. So right there, that destroys the argument that this slavery that's being described in the Bible is similar in any way, shape, or form to the other types of slavery that people tend to get, in a bunch about. So, and again, was any of this, looking at this from the 21st century, looking back, is there anything morally questionable about some of this? Perhaps, right? Because this is from a 21st century perspective. Of course, it smacks of something, archaic, and it looks like something almost barbaric. But in the context of that ancient world, it was actually life-saving to the individuals who would have died from starvation if they had not done it. Okay, so let's go back. So I just want to make sure you have that context, because people say this all the time, and they're just wrong. They're just wrong. It's not the same thing. It's not. It's simplistic, and it casts aspersion upon the Bible unfairly, without having any understanding about what really went on with regard to this type of slavery. Okay, slavery was, and I'll say more about slavery in a little bit. We'll bring some of the New Testament into it as well, because it was a recognized institution even by Paul, right? Even by Paul, who said to the Philemon, who was a slave owner, right? That's what the whole little small one chapter book of Philemon is about. It's about Paul persuading Philemon to take his runaway slave Onesimus back. And essentially Paul tells him, hey, I know that you're within your rights to punish him for having left you, but I urge you not only not to punish him because he's a believer and because he's sorry about what he did, but also the hint is there, you might actually want to consider freeing him, right? So, which is again is an innovation. So let's go back to the text here. So if the master gives him a wife, she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. So when the time comes for him to be freed, whoever came with him into the arrangement goes free with him, because the master has no claim to anything that he had with him, including his wife and his children, when he first got into the arrangement. And it was an arrangement. But if while he was in his service, that's when he met his wife, then the owner has certain rights, and he can't, the person who's going free cannot take her with him or take the children with him. And again, from our perspective in the modern day, that seems sort of, barbaric, right? But, first of all, it was the ancient world, and it was how it was done. And those were the way the property laws were, whether we agree with it or not. It protected the property owner. It protected, to the extent, the wife and the children as well. And he wasn't forced to do it, because he could decide to stay. Verse 5, but if the slave, the servant, plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, he could decide to stay. He didn't have to leave her and abandon her. He could stay. Then his master shall bring him to Elohim. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. So he got his ear pierced. He put his ear to the doorpost, and he pierced it to the door, signifying you now belong to this property, right? And he shall serve him permanently. That was a total choice that he could do. And this is one of those instances where this was a direct slap against the laws of Hammurabi. There was law of Hammurabi that said that if a slave told his master, I don't belong to you, then the master would punish him by essentially cutting off his ear. So he would maim him for life, and then he would keep him anyway, of course. And that would be a sign to others that if you dare, cross me with regard to this relationship between slave and master, because you're my property, I can do it and whatever I want with you. Cut his ear off, for having the audacity to say anything to the master, and you wind up staying with him forever. Most scholars believe that this is a direct slap at that approach, and instead it's just, you're going to pierce the ear, and it's a benign thing that you're just piercing the ear. You're not cutting it off, but it's like a slap at the idea of cutting it off of Hammurabi. You pierce it, and the person stays, and presumably enjoys a life where they have provisions, and they continue the arrangement that they had before. And again, I want to emphasize, there's nothing about this that I'm saying that from a 21st century perspective looks like something that we would want to do in our day. And my intention is not to justify things that were done back then that are not ideal in the present context, but it's the difference between now and what amounts essentially to about 4,000 years ago, right? Things were done differently. Same thing in the next few verses. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do, okay? So she's not a slave. The word here is the word amah, which is, again, it's the equivalent to the Hebrew eved. The word slave, some versions will translate that as a female handmaid. And again, you could see how later in history, as people develop ways of looking at things, and as people learn the different meanings of words or hear these words in other contexts, people develop ideas that are skewed because they don't understand the context of that day. They look at it from the context of today. So just me using the word today, handmaid, some of you are familiar with the show that's on, that's on Hulu these days called Handmaid's Tale. And you think of the word handmaid and you're horrified, right? Handmaid, oh my goodness, that's worse than slave, and in the minds of some people. Well, that's not how it's meant here. So that's, again, it's a transference of a modern day concept, and one that's fictionalized in a way that is to the nth degree of horror, and then transferred onto the Bible, which has nothing to do with what the Bible is talking about. So if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, and again, this has to do with indentured servitude. This is not, and whether we agree with that in the 21st century or not is not the issue. That's the way it was done back then, to protect her. She is not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. So the idea was that if the daughter, because again, women didn't have a lot of protection in the ancient world. If a woman did not marry, she was essentially on her own. She didn't have the employment capability that we have nowadays, right? She didn't have, any version of in the ancient society of the equal rights with regard to employment and equal opportunity for education and all those things that we take for granted today. So if she couldn't get any kind of meaningful work as a servant or whatever, she would starve. If she couldn't have a husband, she wouldn't survive. So this is a thing where the man sells the daughter so that she can survive economically. And the idea was you sell her not as a slave. And people will say that all the time, that she sells his daughter as a slave because of silly translations like this, that they didn't make a distinction. But then if you look at a more modern translation like NIV, you'll see that they'll do something like servant, right? And some places might do it a little bit differently as well, because they recognize a slave is a loaded term. I think that's a mistake whenever you have translations that they don't get up with the times, because then it becomes these loaded terms that put images in people's heads and they can't get their hands around it. So if a man sells his daughter as a female servant, as a servant, she is not to go free. The idea was that he would sell her into indentured servitude with the idea that she would become the master's wife, or that the master could, if he didn't want to marry her, that he would marry her to his son if he had a son. That was the intent. So this is why the context here, if she's displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated for her for himself. What does that mean? Who designated her for himself? That means that he intended to marry her. Okay, that's what it means. He designated her for himself or for his son. And if he can't marry her or won't marry her, and his son can't or won't, or he doesn't have a son, then he shall let her be redeemed. So you got to understand all this terminology to get a better, clearer picture of what's happening here. What is this idea of let her be redeemed? It means that she could be redeemed to one of her own relatives. So if she has a relative who is allowed to, who she can marry, and of course we're talking about like a Boaz Ruth situation where you can have a relative, several times removed, then she can marry within the family. But because he's the master, he has first opportunity to marry her to himself or to his son. He does not have authority to sell her, by the way, to a foreign people. And the word here, foreign people, means exactly that, because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. So this is all means of protection. This is not, and by the way, other women in the ancient world didn't have this that the Israelites had. So, everywhere that people want to dump on the Bible because they want to say, oh, slavery this and women this and whatever, they're actually not only ignorant about the differences between what they say that means and what it actually means, but they're also kicking themselves because they're actually kicking it against things that were done for the protection of these women, protections which didn't exist for any other societies of the time. If he takes to himself another, look at this one, verse 10, to kind of drive my point home, and then we'll move on. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not, in other words, if he gets another wife, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her, the first person, one that he took for a wife originally, which is the daughter of the man who sold, right? The one described here in verse 7, if he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her, the first one, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, and her conjugal rights. What? If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about that he was responsible to feed her. He was responsible to make sure she had clothing. In other words, these are rights of a wife. And her conjugal rights. What are conjugal rights? Well, I think we're all adults in this room. Conjugal rights are sexual rights. So he had to make sure that she had sex, right? And that she was satisfied. So her food, her clothing, and her conjugal rights. Now you tell me, if women in the ancient world who were being oppressed, if all these things were guaranteed to that woman. Here, if she's not guaranteed all three of those things, including sexual rights. So you think about nowadays in the 21st century, you have young girls who are sold into sexual slavery and human trafficking type operations, okay? And in the ancient world, over 4,000 years ago, you had these women who they had to be fed, they had to be clothed. In other words, they had to have all their shelter and their lodging, and they had to have their sexual rights in a positive sense. So don't tell me that women were oppressed in the biblical system or whatever, because when you look at this and you compare it to what other societies had, and even some things that are happening today with women, it doesn't compare. If he will not do these things for her, then she becomes free. She goes out without payment of money. Okay. So, we got to be careful about I'm taking a lot of time with this because these are some of those two issues in particular, slavery and women. People will go to those, return to them again and again as means to disparage the Bible. And I'm tired of hearing it because it's not true. And it's a distortion of what actually the situation was. Okay. 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies. Oh, one more thing I'll say about slavery. I'm sorry. That's not reflected here, but is true. And I said about the ancient world and the New Testament world in particular, that when you think about slaves in the ancient world, most people in the ancient world were slaves. I forget what the figure was, but under the Roman Empire, I want to say that maybe 40% of the people were free. And that may be a little bit on the high side. So if 40% of the people were free, and the rest of them were either in some form of servitude, whether actual outright slaves or indentured servants, that would be about accurate. So when you think about the machinery that we have in the present day, in the modern age, really over the last several hundred years, that didn't exist in the ancient world, right? So what was the machinery of the ancient world? It was slaves. Now you think about something, and it's kind of a bad example, but it illustrates it. You think about what slaves were used for, predominantly in the United States. It was what? It was to pick cotton, right? And to do things in the fields. And then with the invention of the cotton gin, that became, it was kind of a mixed thing, because it's like when you get, it's like with computers, right? And people say that computers, that all of a sudden now it minimizes your work. Actually, it doesn't, right? Because what it does is you could do things faster, but now you just want to do that much work that much faster. Now you're doing it 24/7. When you introduce machinery like something like the cotton gin, now you just want to use your slaves even more, right? So in a certain sense, it made things worse, but in a certain sense, it made things better, because you didn't need as many slaves necessarily to do the work of one cotton gin. So it was kind of a mixed bag. But as time went on and laws changed, and and everything happened as it happened, then obviously that evil was washed away, but not completely, right? It came up in other ways and forms. And but as far as the mechanics of slavery, right? So my point is about that is we can argue from here to the cows come home in terms of, whether institutions kept some form of slavery, et cetera. But I'm talking about just the sheer mechanics of it and the economics of it. It was, even if they wanted to continue that, they couldn't do it because with all the advances in technology, et cetera, it invalidated the need to do that. But in the ancient world, you had none of that. So in the ancient world, when you're talking about the indentured servants and outright slaves in the Roman Empire, criminals, for example, who were truly slaves, then what did you do? You used the slaves because you didn't have all that machinery. So they would do all the manual work. Israel in Egypt, right? They were making bricks. Well, you didn't have the kind of conveniences that you have nowadays in the mixers and everything else to form the bricks and all the things that can be done by technology. It's the people that wind up doing that. And of course, there are going to be abuses in place because of that. But what happens in the ancient world, let's kind of fast forward to Paul's time, where slaves still existed in the midst of the Roman Empire. If you try to completely do away with slavery, which of course was going to be a non-starter anyway in that world. Even if you tried to do that, you would have major upheaval because how would you get the work done? How would you get it done? You couldn't do it. There was no machinery. There was no press. There was no automobiles. There were no trucks to deliver things and on and on. So you had to use what was necessary in that economy. Let me ask you a question. And this is just for you to answer in your own head. Is there anyone here, and again, I don't want you to answer out loud, is there anyone here who doesn't believe, forget about your politics and what you believe, I'm just talking about logically speaking, and from the evidence that we know, is there anyone here who truly believes that the current automobiles that we have and the trucks and the SUVs and everything else, is there anyone here who doesn't believe that there's some harm being done to the environment because of fossil fuel burning and all that stuff? Is there anyone here who believes that? Even if you don't believe in radical environmentalism and all that, is there anyone here, conservative or liberal, who doesn't believe that there's some damage being done to the environment and that we'd be better off if we had ways of, using combustible engines that didn't burn the kind of fossil fuel in the way in which they burned them or as they're going right now? Is there anyone who really believes that? I would dare say that if I polled each one of you individually, that every one of you would tell me that you know on a certain level that there's damage being done. So here's the next question. How many of you are willing to trade your car in tomorrow and get rid of it and go back to being on foot, or get yourself a horse, or get yourself a donkey, or go back and live like the Amish and get yourself, a horse and buggy? How many of you are willing to do that? Probably not many of you, right? I know I'm not. I'll be straight with you, right? Not at all. So what are we saying then? Are we saying that we're willing? Isn't another way of saying that to say that we're willing to put up with a little bit of pollution and a little bit of injustice and get the horse and buggy because then it's cruel to the animal. Exactly. That'll be something else. Slavery, actually. Exactly. Okay, but we won't do that because we know the level of inconvenience that would cause, and we know inherently that there's something wrong with that system. But what is it? It's the best that we have, and if we try to all of a sudden overnight change that, like some radical environmentalists want us to do, it would so dramatically reduce our ability to get things done that it would probably cause more harm than good. So what do? We try to do things responsibly, right? We try to set better laws. So you can only have certain levels of carbon emissions and you try to stay within those things. Or you try to make more electric vehicles so that you can start little by little reducing the carbon footprint and reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Who here doesn't think that reducing foreign dependency on foreign oil wouldn't be a good thing, so that we're not beholden to nations of the world that try to consistently take advantage of us or start wars or do things because, right? I mean, this is, Putin in Russia is doing that right now with Europe. He supplies most of the gas and oil and petroleum products for Europe. And right now he's essentially trying to blackmail everybody in that part of the world because he has designs on Ukraine. And then they're holding back and doing whatever they need to do or say to him because they don't want to get their oil cut off, right? It's like this kind of extortion that goes on, right? That's the kind of stuff that we have to look at all those things. It's never as simple as everyone tries to make it out to be. So we can't just all of a sudden say tomorrow, okay, tomorrow, everyone turn your cars into the government and go get yourself, a horse or whatever. We're not going to do that, right? But when you think about the ancient world, when people sit here in the 21st century and they cast judgment on the Bible and the people of the Bible, and they want to say things like, well, they supported slavery. Well, of course they supported slavery. That was the economic system of the day, and it would have been the equivalent to try to get rid of every slave at one time. It would have been the equivalent of turning in all your vehicles one day. See, we need to think things through if we're going to really have a better understanding of all this. So anyway, more I could say about that, but I actually took most of the time doing that. Sorry about that. Let's keep going here. So 21:12. Can we see the text again? I'll come back to your comment in a little bit. 21:12. But he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. So capital punishment, right? And by the way, murder as being punishable, murder as a capital offense, being punishable by death, is universal in the Torah. In all 5 books of the scriptures, do you have murder specifically? This is the importance of it listed as a capital offense. And if you want to write down a few verses, we don't have time to go to them, but I'm going to give you a few verses. So Genesis 9:6 and 14. That's where it appears in Genesis. Exodus 21:12. And there are others here in Exodus as well. Leviticus 24:17. Numbers 35:16 forward. And Deuteronomy 19:11 through 13. Capital offense. And there's also a distinction made between murder that's done, killing that's done intentionally, murder, premeditated, and then death that occurs that is not premeditated, but for which you still bear responsibility, which is manslaughter, or something like we would have in our present system of jurisprudence, involuntary manslaughter. And there are different types of rules recognizing the different types of severity and intention in those laws. So he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. But right, but if he did not lie in wait for him, in other words, it wasn't premeditated, but Elohim let him fall into his hand. It's interesting, but Elohim let him fall into his hand. In other words, Yahweh in his permissive will just, let it happen, which is, it happens all the time. Then that's a case of manslaughter, right? That's like people will use the expression also, even in law, they'll use the expression an act of Elohim, right? Then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. And we don't have time to go to it, but Numbers 35 forward talks about places called places of refuge. And those places of refuge were places of exile where you could go to flee from the hand of the avenger. Why? Because even if you killed someone without premeditation, if you killed a family member of someone, just the natural emotion that comes up with that family member is going to cause them to want to take your life or the life of one of your loved ones, right? In compensation. And that's just the natural human reaction. So they were provided what were called places of refuge so that they could flee to that place. But it was up to them. If you didn't go and you got caught by one of the people from the family, too bad, right? And that person was not going to be held liable for your death because they were just avenging the death of the other man. It was a different world, remember? Yeah, it's a different world. And we have similar kinds of things going on in our present world today, but there are different nuances and flavors because we have thousands of years of history in between and of the evolution of legal concepts, right? But it's a similar type of thing. That's what happened with Cain. Exactly, right? That Cain had the mark on him, and because he knew that people were going to come after him, right? Okay, so let me go back to the text here. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. Wow, sorry about that. So murder allowed no shelter. And again, that's another innovation, another biblical innovation. Other ancient societies could allow a murderer to weasel his way out of it. And they provided some level of protection. The ancient societies, Phoenicia, Syria, Greece, Rome, they all had the altar or temple provided protection to fugitives. But unique to the scriptures, unique to Yahweh, not even on his altar, because that person was presumptuous toward his neighbor, and that that presumption that to murder a fellow image bearer, that merited not even protection on his altar that he may die. All right. So if, however, a man acts presumptuously towards his neighbor, so it's killing craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. And by the way, things like he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death, right? But so the implication, someone's going to put him to death, not Yahweh necessarily, right? You're going to do it. So if let's just look at 14. If, however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. That's an important distinction, and it's a subtlety that we need to know, right? You do it. You're going to take him from my altar and you're going to kill him. Why is that important? You think about the modern day argument that people do politically, that they say that, and people say this all the time, and from a biblical perspective, they're wrong. They don't have a leg to stand on. And that's people will say all the time in their moral high horse, they'll say, only God has the right to take another life. So that's one of the arguments used against capital punishment. They'll say, another human being doesn't have a right to take a life. You don't have a right to take a life. Only God has the right to take a life. According to the scripture, you have the responsibility as a fellow image bearer to take that evil away from society and to make sure that that person can never kill someone like that again. You have the thing to do it. Yahweh's not going to do it. You're going to do it. And that's important to understand. So, and of course, there's an implication that there's a court that's going to do it. There's in many of these passages, in the next few verses, you see the term mot yamut, which means he shall be put to death. So mot yamut, and the implication is, and all commentators agree that means that a court is going to be the one that's going to put him to death by their judgment. So so you're to take it from the altar. And by the way, we have an example of this in 1 Kings 2, 28 to 34. I won't go there because of lack of time. 1 Kings, you can note it. 1 Kings 2, 28 to 34. And this was the case of Joab, David's general. David's general, Joab, that guy was a piece of work, let me tell you. He was a faithful servant to David, but he was a ruthless, bloodthirsty man. And he killed at least 2 people, probably more. He killed at least 2 people that were innocent, and he took their lives craftily in deceit, exactly as being described here. And David, he made sure that Solomon knew, don't let him go down to his grave in peace, make him pay for what he did to these guys. And sure enough, when David died and Solomon became king, he went. One of the first things he did is he went after Joab. Joab ran into the temple. He put into the sanctuary. He grabbed the horns of the altar, and when someone told Solomon, Joab said, you need to, if you're going to kill me right here. And then Solomon heard it, and he didn't have any compunction whatsoever in saying, you know what, do exactly as he says. And they killed him right on the altar. Perfect fulfillment of this. 21:15, he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Right? That are clear. And there are all kinds of ramifications of this. And like I said, I wish I could go through all these in greater detail, but I can't. But the level of respect that you're supposed to have for your parents is incredible, right? He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. So kidnapping was a capital offense. He who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death, right? This is not, using a swear word on them, right? This involves something deeper than that. But the idea is the level of disrespect that you show to a parent by cursing your father or mother is something punishable by death. Now, is there a record of any of these things actually being taken to court and put in? Not really, right? But I think that the commentators are more apt to say that this was written. It was not necessarily implemented, but it was written so that you wouldn't have to implement it. So people would look at it and fear, and they did. It wasn't like today, right? Today, you almost have to do these things instantaneously, or people don't fear them and they don't take it seriously. But we don't live in that kind of world. No one's doing that. 18, very important passage here that I don't have time to go deeply into. Well, actually, this is not the one that I'm looking at. The one I'm considering is 22, but let's look at 18. If men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. I'm sorry, folks. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay. Can everyone still see the screen? Okay. All right. So, so this has to do with compensation. If someone hurts another, and is degrees of compensation because of the level of the severity of the injury. Okay. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. Okay. So this, I would need a good half an hour to an hour to really explain this fully. This similarly has to do with a severity of a particular injury. This here, if however he survives the day, the word here is the word amad, which means to stand. So the interpretation of this that most commentators have of this is that it's not that he survives a day or two, is that if he is able to stand after the beating, then it's presumed that if he dies later after 1 or 2 days, that it may not have been the beating that killed him. It may have been something else, and therefore that case is treated a little bit differently. Is there still some moral ambiguity here in the eyes of a 21st century person? Sure. But that's it. Again, there's more going on than meets the eye here. 22 to 25 is widely debated. If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay. Now, this is an important passage because this is one that's often looked at with regard to the whole debate over abortion. And part of the confusion is that where it says here she gives birth prematurely, some versions. So if you went and you look at the same text over, let's say the King James version, what it actually says is if she miscarriages, right, which is a very different thing. So if you look at Exodus 21. Okay, so the King James says, if men strive and hurt a woman with child so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow. So if her fruit depart from her, many have traditionally interpreted that as miscarriage. In other words, the baby is born dead, but that's not necessarily what it says, right? So the term that's used here, and then when you couple that with the term there is no injury, the word ason is debated hotly back and forth. Then one thing is done as compared to the other. If the baby's born prematurely, but no injury comes to either the baby or to the woman. So I want to read you kind of a summary of this because I don't have time to go into it. They're like in the commentary I'm looking at here, which is Dennis Prager's commentary on it's called the Rational Bible. Is one of a dozen commentaries that I can consult, but he explains this really well. I want to just read you the summary after he goes back and forth over a page and a half of looking at different things here, because I think that his conclusion is right on the money. So he says, It therefore seems clear that what the verses are saying is this: if the mother gives birth and there is no harm to either her or to the children, in other words, she gives birth, is what's happened is that she's given birth prematurely. They're fighting. One of the men strikes her, and it causes her, the stress, either physically or and emotionally or both, causes her to go into preterm labor, and the baby winds up being born, which obviously is not an ideal situation. He's caused that, right? He's been the direct cause of that. So if the mother gives birth and there is no harm to either her or to the children, the husband goes to the court, which finds the man who induced premature birth. But if there is no harm, ason, that's that word ason, whether injury or death to either the children or the mother, then punishment. But if there is harm, whether injury or death to either the children or the mother, then punishment is life for a life, eye for an eye, etc. Okay. So, and this concept of eye for an eye, life for life also, and I wish I had more time to explain that, the whole law of lex talionis, this is not meant to be taken literally, okay? Because it would be irrational to do that. For example, if you pull the person's eye out, there's a good chance you're going to kill that person, right? So then you're not talking about justice there if you're looking strictly at the literalness of it. So this concept of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, it's equality of worth, equality of value, right? In other words, your eye is not more important than my eye, or my eye more important than your eye. Your foot is not worth more to you than my foot is worth to me. So if you cause me to lose a foot, then you need to compensate me, equally to what I would have lost, because we are equal in the eyes of Yahweh as fellow image bearers, and so there has to be a level of compensation that's going to be commensurate with the particular injury that's been done to me. Okay, so if a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, then he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Again, similar concept. You're going to compensate this person based upon the worth or the value of what it is that they have lost. And that applies equally to servants as it does to free people. If an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. If, however, an ox was previously in the habit of goring and its owner has been warned, yet he does not confine it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned and its owner also shall be put to death. See, that's very interesting, right? If an ox was previously in the habit, in other words, they've done this before, and the owner didn't do anything about it. The owner is warned. You see how you can get principles from these case studies? If they knew something, if the owner had been warned, he doesn't take action, he doesn't confine it, and it kills a man or woman, the ox is going to be stoned, he's going to lose the ox, and its owner shall be put to death, because the owner, now this is a capital offense, because now the owner has literally ignored the advice, to seeing that this thing has happened before, and it's just another accident waiting to happen, a tragedy really waiting to happen. The owner didn't do anything about it. So now the owner, it's as if it's a premeditated thing, because it's like they said, it happened, but I don't really care. It's not going to happen again. I'm just going to take a chance. And it goes into, now you've directly contributed to the death of another person, right? If a ransom is demanded of him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is demanded of him. Whether it gores a son or a daughter, it shall be done to him according to the same rule. It's that equality thing, right? If the equality of value, if the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. You see, so you could see how you could take these principles and come up with a whole bunch of different situations. And it's interesting because, you're looking at practicality in our present day. There's a case, I literally just read about a case today, that way you can use a principle like this, right? And there's a 21-year-old college student who was just about ready to graduate, very lovely looking young lady. They had a picture there, and she was asked to look after a couple of dogs by a couple, and one of them was, I think they were both like German Shepherd. No, it was a German Shepherd mix, and the other one was Pit Bull mix. And so these are not golden retrievers, right? I mean, they're, but the dogs themselves are what they are. The owners have to take into account what their breed is and all that, right? Dogs get a bad rap. It's really owners who have the issue. So they were supposed to crate these dogs And they had told her that they were going to create these dogs so that she could look after them. And they left and they texted her that they forgot to crate the dogs. And then she went to, and I don't know if she was already in process or when she got there, she just figured, okay, well, I'll just get them in the crate when I get inside. And as soon as she got in, she got mauled. She got essentially her face ripped off. It was terrible. She survived, but 21 years old, and she's disfigured for life. What do you do with owners like that, right? Do you just say, oh, oops? Can't just say oops, right? As tragic as that is, and as much as the owners, probably didn't want that to happen, what are you going to do? Now, if you start asking questions and you find out, someone came to the house once before, and we had a previous sitter who comes out as a witness and said, you know what, they haven't created that time either, and I narrowly escaped, a maiming. Then if that happens, then wouldn't you be able to apply a verse like this? Sure you would, right? That's what I'm talking about with case law. So these are things that there's nothing new under the sun. Back then it's an ox. Today it's a dog mix, right? 33. If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it over, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead animal shall become his. Right? Similar types of laws. This, you have responsibility to not be negligent. Right? If one man's ox, verse 35, if one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide its price equally, and also they shall divide the dead ox. Or if it is known that the ox was previously in the habit of goring, here it is again, that negligence, yet its owner has not confined it, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall become his. Okay, so I don't. You can see clearly the application behind things like this, I think. All right, I think I'm not going to be able to get into these other chapters here. I spent so much time, but hopefully that discussion was helpful for you. The whole of chapter 22 is pretty much just other individual examples of negligence, right? If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes so that stacked grain or the standing grain of the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall make restitution, right? And it's similar things here. This is the case of both parties shall come before the judges. So there was a system of judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. So many cases, and you can look at these in their turn. Just a few of these very quickly here. If a man seduces a virgin, this is 22:16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. Again, a protection of a woman, right? So people who say that women were just oppressed all left and right in the Bible, they're obviously not looking at the same Bible I'm looking at. This is a man who seduces a virgin who's not engaged, and if he takes her, then he has to pay a dowry for her, and he has to marry her. Right? Now, if her father refuses to give her to him because maybe she didn't want to be with him after the way he is, right? And the father says he refuses to give her, then he shall pay money equal to the dowry for virgins. So that's protection, all around protections. You shall not allow a sorceress to live. Right? I'm curious, given the fact that the word sorceress is the word kashaf, and if you look up that word, it means to whisper a spell, to enchant or practice magic, sorcerer, witchcraft, and that term would be related to the English word pharmakia, which is the word from which we get the word pharmacy, pharmaceutical, right? Which has to do with drugs. Because why? What is the connection? Well, drugs alter your mind, right? Cast a spell. It's as if they're casting a spell, and they give you an altered state. Is the term I'm looking for. You shall not allow a sorceress to live. And by the way, male sorcerers are not allowed to live either. So what is this concept here? I mean, if we put that into the present day, and if we implemented something like this, I think that we'd have a little bit of a deterrent for drug dealers, right? Because they'd be considered as being modern day sorcerers and sorceresses. So if this is one of the ones that I wish were on the books in the present day in some way, shape, or form. Whoever lies to the animal, bestiality, shall surely be put to death. He who sacrifices to any Elohim other than to Yahweh alone shall be utterly destroyed. Okay, it's all kinds of implications there. You shall not, I love this one, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? This is something that, and all of these, you could look at these laws together in terms of oppression. Um, this issues dealing with racism, et cetera, would look differently if people would take things like this to heart, right? You should not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers. There's always the remembrance. Remember what you went through. Don't put anyone else through that thing too, right? People forget. They're very forgetful. They're oftentimes willfully forgetful. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. There's always a protection of the underprivileged in society, right? The underdog, the widow, the orphan. If you afflict him at all, and if he does cry out to me, I will surely hear his cry, and my anger will be kindled, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and your children fatherless. It's kind of serious, right? If you afflict the widow or the orphan, you run the risk of capital punishment. You run the risk of total destruction from Elohim. So I guess that's pretty important to pay attention to, right? And yet people today afflict the widow and the orphan, metaphorically speaking, all the time, right? They take advantage of the widow and orphan all the time. And they do it with impunity. They do it with impunity. And if we implemented something like this, and if people feared Elohim, we'd have a very different story. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act as a creditor to him. It's oppression, right? You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets, for that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. I love that. See, all these passages here imply ultimately you have to answer to me, to Yahweh. Ultimately, all these things, you better do it, because ultimately I am the Redeemer. I am the defender. There's one verse, I don't remember where it is. I think it's in Job, or it's either in Job or in the Psalms, that Yahweh says, where is, I want to look this one up. Oh, it's in Proverbs. Hello. It's a favorite of mine. 10. Proverbs 23:10. Do not move an ancient boundary stone or encroach on the fields of the fatherless, for their defender is strong. He will take up their case against you. I love how they capitalize defender, because that Gaal is Yahweh himself, right? Don't encroach on the fields of the fatherless. Don't mix with the underdog, because I'm their defender, and he'll take up their case against you. You won't have to worry about your neighbor. You'll have to worry about me. I love that. You shall not curse Elohim, nor curse the ruler of your people. This not curse the ruler of your people. I think we'd have a lot less of the vitriol out there if we didn't, if people would obey something like that. Okay, there's so many more. I'm just kind of passing over this, different laws here. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it at that. There are laws about the sabbatical year, right? 6 days and the Sabbath. The feast days, of course, are listed here. Bringing the first fruits. Okay, so all kinds of great stuff. This is talking about the angel of Yahweh, who is Yahshua in a pre-existent form. So much good stuff here that I just didn't get to, sorry. Okay, there were a couple of comments here. Let's see here. It is simple enough to come to an understanding of how nuanced an issue like slavery is, but the greater concept of Yahweh not only allowing, but sometimes mandating what's largely perceived as cruelty from his followers remains fairly difficult. For example, the times in the Bible when the wiping out of an entire civilization was commanded, women and children included. I think this sort of mindset is what people are getting at when they gripe about slavery. Not so easy to explain. Yeah, you're right. It's not so easy to explain, and that's a good example. And that's one I'd have to take a whole study to do. Things like what you're referring to as the cherem, which is a whole town or whole nation designated for destruction, right? And that's one of the biggest examples that people turn to, along with slavery, etc. But just like, all I'll say for now, because you're right, we need to look at that more deeply. All I'll say for now is not everything is as meets the eye, right? And in the same way that I just explained in just a few minutes, something to at least give you pause about slavery and about the way women were treated supposedly and oppressed, right? there's much more than meets the eye in those cases, and there's much more than meets the eye in what you're describing as well. My problem is not that people have the question. My problem is not that people are disturbed by that, or that people find things potentially morally questionable. My problem is that they reach the conclusion, they jump to the conclusion, and they lay it out for everybody as if it's a conclusion without seeking the evidence, and without waiting for the answer, without asking someone, what does that really mean? So they come to the conclusion, and now they've just disparaged a whole host of people who believe in the Bible, because they can't have the patience to actually go and look for the answer. They're just gonna make it up out of whole cloth, out of thin air, and they're gonna disparage everyone else. That's not the way you do things. That's how the mob does it. That's a Twitter response to an issue. That's why we have such low civility in our country anymore, in our world really anymore, and we can't reach conclusions that are fair and accurate, that look at all points of view, because people, they don't look for the evidence first to know what they speak before they spout it out. They just go present stuff, and because it sounds nice and people know how to use words, and they're wordsmiths, and they can make something look pretty in a blog, right? And people look at that and they say, oh yeah, that's what it means. Oh yeah, the Bible was this, and the Bible was that, and it's that. No, you didn't. You're listening to an ignoramus who doesn't know what they're talking about, who's speaking out of emotion rather than knowledge. That is the issue that I have with that. So I agree with you. Those things are questionable on their surface. So let's find out what it actually means before we reach a conclusion and disparage thousands of people who believe in the Bible. That's my problem. Truly enjoyed your clarification and its application, how it was meant at those times. Thank you. I'm glad. It may have been that I was totally exhausted when the kids were little, or maybe you have more understanding on the Torah portions of both, but your explanation makes total sense to me. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think, honestly, it's because I didn't have the level of understanding that I have now, because I have so many more better resources, and I'm being more careful about study, so I know what I'm speaking of, right? But I didn't have that knowledge. It wasn't you, it was me. For many people, it was not the servitude of slavery, but the cruelty. Yeah, true, right? And there are laws against the cruelty too, right? So even with these laws that are different from for example, the slavery that we went through here in the United States, even with the cases of indentured servitude, there are all kinds of laws to prevent that kind of cruelty. Right. So, so in the one hand, you have a section there that you saw that says, if you beat the slave and he survives, after a day or two, remember that verse? And then a few verses down, it says that if you damage one of your slave's eyes, they go free. So when you put the two together, there's a message being sent, right? Don't even beat the slave, because you idiot, if you beat him and in your anger, you injure his eye, you automatically forfeit your right to the slave, and you no longer have him as your property, right? So the idea is, don't do it at all, right? Don't even wait to see if he survives a day or two. Don't even get to the point where you beat him, because you're probably going to lose him, right? Yeah. You're also frustrated by shallow thinkers. I agree. But you know what? In all fairness, I think those shallow thinkers exist on both sides too. And that angers me too, especially when that kind of shallow thinking comes from believers who also do the same thing in the other direction, right? So you have the non-believers who are questioning the moral ambiguity in their minds of certain things in the scriptures, and they have legitimate concerns. So for the ones who actually are bringing the concerns and not jumping to conclusions and waiting for the answer, I have high respect for that. And I'm willing to go and do the dirty work and go and dig and do what we got to do to get to the bottom of it. Even if we don't fully agree on the issue at the end of the day, that's okay. Let's at least have the discussion. I respect that. But then there are the ones who don't do that and just want to disparage me because they want to assume that what they believe is what is. But then there are the people who are so-called believers who also want to cast aspersion on those who don't believe in the Bible, and they're the ones who are going to assign motive to everyone, right? And this person, this evil, wicked person, and blah blah blah. But shut up. I mean, you don't know what that person's life is like, so stop it. If you want people to treat you and your beliefs about the Bible with respect, then you have to exercise the same courtesy and give the person out there the benefit of the doubt and not ascribe motive to them. Anyway, I'm a little spunky today, so the issues remain. You're right. Definitely reason for pause on both sides of the argument. Yep, absolutely. Very exhausted. Yeah, I was very exhausted too. And the fact that people use the Bible to defend that cruelty, totally. Very enlightening. Thank you, Brother Clark. Yep. This also gives credence to the justice and truth of our Elohim. Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your great comments. Is there any other like quickie question that I can answer, or any last minute thing that anyone wanted to bring up before we close for today? And if not, that's okay.